The light flickered above the worn linoleum floor, casting intermittent shadows across the cramped hallway of the West Side apartments. It was the kind of building where dreams came to hibernate, not die exactly, but to rest in a suspended animation, while reality took precedence. In apartment 4B, Walter Lyons stood at his kitchen counter, carefully measuring out coffee grounds into a filter. The process was methodical, deliberate, one of the few moments in his day where precision still mattered. At 68, Walter's hands weren't as steady as they once were. The same hands that had once guided some of Hollywood's most promising talent through the nuances of Meisner technique and emotional recall now occasionally trembled when reaching for his medication. The apartment was small, embarrassingly so for someone who had once commanded respect in the studios of Los Angeles, but it was what he could afford now, on a pension that seemed to shrink as steadily as his prominence in the industry. The walls of Walter's apartment told a story that his pride would never allow him to verbalize. Faded photographs in simple frames captured moments from another lifetime. Walter standing beside a young Kevin West after his breakthrough performance. Walter accepting a small teaching award at the Academy workshop. Walter with his arm around Gregory Wiggins when the latter landed his first major role. These were memories from when Walter Lyons was a name that opened doors in Hollywood, not one that people struggled to remember. Today was Tuesday, which meant Walter would walk 6 blocks to the community center where he taught acting classes. To retirees and the occasional optimistic teenager, the pay was negligible, but the routine gave his week structure, and structure was something Walter clung to as everything else in his life seemed increasingly formless. He took his coffee to the small table by the window, nudging aside a stack of past-due notices to make room for the mug. The morning light revealed dust particles dancing in the air, the kind of detail Walter had once taught his students to notice and incorporate into their performances. Reality is in the minutiae, he would say. Anyone can portray the grand emotions, but the true artist finds humanity in how someone watches dust in a sunbeam. Walter's phone buzzed, an ancient flip phone that had become an unintentional statement against modernity. The screen displayed Brent Christensen, one of his former students who still checked in occasionally. "Walter? It's Brent. Just wanted to make sure we're still on for coffee tomorrow." Walter cleared his throat before answering. "Yes, of course. The usual place at 10. "Great. And hey, I might have a lead on some coaching work if you're interested. Small, independent film, but the director is someone to watch." Walter felt the familiar flicker of hope that he had learned to immediately temper. "That sounds promising. We can discuss it tomorrow." After hanging up, Walter sipped his coffee and watched the world outside his window. People rushed by, clutching phones and coffee cups, perpetually late for something important. None of them looked up. None of them noticed the older man watching. From the second floor of a building whose best days had come and gone before most of them were born, Walter finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and began preparing for his class. He selected a worn copy of True and False by David Mamet, not because he agreed with all of Mamet's assertions, but because the provocative text reliably sparked discussion among his students. He placed it in his leather satchel alongside his notes and a bottle of water. Before leaving, Walter stood before the small mirror in his hallway and straightened his collar. Despite his circumstances, he maintained a certain dignity in his appearance, pressed shirts, polished shoes, and a posture that defied the weight of disappointment he carried. "Presentation," he would tell his students, "is the first line of your unspoken dialogue with the world." The walk to the community center was Walter's daily meditation. He observed the changing neighborhood, new coffee shops with minimalist aesthetics, replacing family-owned businesses, young professionals gliding by on electric scooters, construction crews laying the groundwork for luxury apartments. Los Angeles was shedding another skin, leaving people like Walter feeling increasingly like artifacts from a bygone era. At the community center, Walter was greeted by Dana Jackson, the program coordinator who had hired him 3 years ago. "Morning, Walter," she said, her smile genuine but hurried. "Room 3 today. The dance class needed your usual space." "That's fine," Walter replied, though it wasn't. Room 3 was smaller, with harsh fluorescent lighting that created precisely the wrong environment for the vulnerability required in acting exercises. But Walter had long ago learned which battles were worth fighting. His class that day consisted of 7 people, 3 retirees looking for a creative outlet, 2 community college students who couldn't afford formal acting school, a middle-aged woman going through a divorce, and a young man named Cole Harris who possessed genuine talent but lacked the connections to make use of it. Walter led them through vocal warm-ups, then a series of exercises designed to promote presence and authentic reaction. "Acting isn't about pretending," Walter explained as he circled the room. "It's about finding the truth in imaginary circumstances. Your body doesn't know the difference between a real emotion and one you've summoned for performance. It experiences both as authentic." Cole raised his hand. "But what about technical aspects? Don't those matter too?" Walter nodded, appreciating the question. "Technique is the scaffold upon which you build your performance. Without it, your emotional truth has no structure. But technique without authentic emotion is just mechanical movement. It might be precise, but it won't move an audience." As the class progressed, Walter found himself thinking about his own career trajectory. He had never wanted to be in front of the camera himself. His passion had always been in developing others, in seeing the raw potential in someone and helping them refine it into something luminous. In his prime, Walter had been sought after by studios and established actors alike, known for his ability to push performers past their self-imposed limitations. Then the industry changed. New methods gained popularity. Younger coaches with Instagram accounts and TED Talks began attracting the attention that once came his way. Walter hadn't adapted quickly enough, had dismissed social media as a fad rather than recognizing it as the fundamental shift in professional visibility that it was. By the time Walter realized his mistake, he was already being described in the past tense at industry events. "Walter Lyons, he was brilliant. Whatever happened to him?" After class, Cole lingered, helping Walter gather his materials. "Mr. Lyons, I was wondering if you might have time for a private session this week. I've got an audition for a student film, and I really want to be prepared." Walter hesitated. Private. Coaching had once been his primary income, but now he charged a fraction of his former rate, and even then, requests were rare. "I think I could manage that. Thursday afternoon, perhaps." Cole looked relieved. "That would be perfect, thank you." As Walter left the community center, the weight of his current reality settled back onto his shoulders. He decided to take a different route home, one that passed by the old Westwood Theatre, where he had once attended premieres featuring actors he had helped shape. The theatre was now a high-end clothing store, all traces of its former identity erased, except for the architectural details that couldn't be economically removed. Walter paused across the street, watching customers enter and exit with shopping bags. He wondered how many of them knew they were walking on ground where artists had once been celebrated, where stories had been shared in the darkness among strangers who for 2 hours became a community bound by narrative. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, are you Walter Lyons?" Walter turned to find a young woman, Lisa Avila, according to the ID badge hanging from her neck, looking at him with curious eyes. "Yes, I am," he replied, surprised to be recognized. "I thought so. I'm an assistant at Horizon Talent. My boss, Justin Murphy, mentioned you once. He said you were the best acting coach he ever observed." Walter felt a warm glow of recognition. "Justin was always very kind. Please give him my regards." "I will." Are you still teaching, in a manner of speaking? Community center classes primarily. Lisa looked genuinely disappointed. That's a shame. Justin made it sound like you were some kind of wizard with actors. Walter smiled politely. Even wizards retire eventually. Have a good day, Miss Avila. He continued his walk home, the brief interaction leaving him with conflicting emotions. There was gratification in being remembered, but also a sharp reminder of all he had lost. By the time Walter reached his apartment building, a light rain had begun to fall, matching his mood. The rest of Walter's day passed in quiet routine. He made a simple dinner, reviewed notes for tomorrow's class, and spent an hour responding to emails from former students who occasionally sought his advice. Around 8 o'clock, he settled into his worn armchair with a dog-eared copy of The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, a writer whose unflinching examination of grief and resilience resonated with Walter's own experience of losing his professional identity. The rain intensified outside, drumming against his window in an irregular rhythm. Walter was just considering making a cup of tea when his doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence at any hour, but particularly surprising in the evening. When he opened the door, Walter found himself staring at a face he instantly recognized, despite the baseball cap pulled low and the casual clothes that seemed deliberately nondescript. Leonardo DiCaprio stood in his hallway, slightly damp from the rain, with an expression that suggested he was prepared for Walter not to recognize him. "Mr. Lyons," Leonardo said quietly, "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit." Walter blinked, momentarily speechless. "Mr. DiCaprio, this is unexpected. May I come in? I'd rather not stand in the hallway if that's okay." Walter stepped aside, suddenly acutely aware of his small, modest apartment. "Of course, please." Leonardo entered, removing his cap as Walter closed the door behind him. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, the absurdity of the situation hanging between them. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Walter finally asked, falling back on basic hospitality. "Water would be fine, thank you." As Walter went to the kitchen, his mind raced. Leonardo DiCaprio, one of the most recognizable actors in the world, was standing in his living room. They had never worked together, had never even met as far as Walter could recall. The situation made no sense. Walter returned with 2 glasses of water, handing one to his unexpected guest. "I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here," Leonardo said, accepting the water. "The thought had crossed my mind," Walter replied, gesturing for Leonardo to take a seat on the small sofa while he returned to his armchair. Leonardo sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'm working on a role, a complex one. It's a character unlike any I've played before, and I'm struggling with it." Walter nodded, professional interest immediately engaged despite his confusion. "And you came to me? Why?" "Christopher Fletcher. He was my first real acting coach back when I was just getting started. We had dinner last month and I mentioned the challenges I was having with this character. He said, 'You need Walter Lyons.' Said you were the best he'd ever seen at helping actors break through walls they'd built for themselves." Walter felt a surge of emotion at the mention of Christopher, an old colleague and friend he hadn't spoken to in years. "Christopher always was generous with his praise," Walter said quietly. "He wasn't being generous. He was being specific. He said, 'You understand the psychology of performance better than anyone he's ever met. And right now, that's exactly what I need.'" Leonardo DiCaprio took a sip of water, his eyes scanning the modest apartment with interest rather than judgment. Walter noticed how the actor observed the photographs on the walls, lingering on the images of younger actors whose careers had blossomed under Walter's guidance. "I've heard stories about you for years," Leonardo continued, "not just from Christopher. Jill Vaughn mentioned you when we were filming in Argentina, said you completely transformed her approach to character work." And Kenneth Taylor told me you were the one who helped him through that breakdown he had on the Peterson film when no one else could reach him. Walter was surprised to hear these names. Former students who had gone on to substantial careers. People he hadn't spoken to in years. They were already talented. I just helped them access what was already there. Leonardo shook his head. That's not how they tell it. He set his glass down. Look, I wouldn't normally show up at someone's door like this. I know it's unconventional, but this role, it's important, not just for my career, but... He paused, searching for words. There are some roles that find you at exactly the right moment in your life. They're not just characters you play. They're vehicles for something you need to work through personally. Walter nodded slowly. This was something he understood deeply. The strange alchemy that sometimes occurred between an actor and a role, when the boundaries between performance and personal catharsis blurred. Tell me about the character, Walter said. Professional, curiosity overriding his initial shock. He's a former prodigy who peaked early, someone who had everything, talent, recognition, success, and then lost it all. Not through some dramatic fall from grace, but slowly, incrementally, until one day he wakes up and realizes he's become irrelevant to the very world he once defined. Leonardo's eyes met Walter's directly. He's someone who has to rediscover his worth in a world that's moved on without him. The parallel wasn't subtle. Walter felt a flash of indignation. Was this some kind of charitable project? Had Christopher sent Leonardo here out of pity, and you thought I'd have special insight into this character? Walter's tone was cooler. Now, Leonardo didn't flinch. I thought you'd understand him in ways that would make my portrayal more honest. This isn't charity, Mr. Lyons. This is me needing the best possible guide for a journey I'm not sure how to navigate. Walter stood, walking to the window. The rain had intensified, streaming down the glass in rivulets that distorted the streetlights outside. Even if I wanted to help you, my coaching methods require time. Consistency. They're not compatible with your schedule or the resources available to me now. I've cleared my schedule for the next 3 weeks. No commitments, no distractions. And as for resources, Leonardo gestured around the apartment. I don't need a state-of-the-art studio, just a space to work and someone who knows how to push me past my limitations. Walter turned back to face him. Why not work with one of the current favorites? There are plenty of coaches with more recent credits, more modern methods, because they're technicians, not teachers. They can help me hit my marks and modulate my voice, but they can't help me find the soul of this character. Leonardo stood. Now too, his expression earnest. Mr. Lyons, Walter, I didn't come here looking for techniques. I came looking for wisdom. The sincerity in Leonardo's voice gave Walter pause. He studied the actor's face, looking for any sign of condescension or pity, but found only genuine respect and what appeared to be a touch of vulnerability. 3 weeks is hardly enough time, Walter finally said. It's a start. Walter sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I'll need to know everything about the character, the script, the director's vision. And I should warn you, my methods aren't always comfortable. Leonardo smiled for the first time since arriving. That's exactly what Christopher said you'd say. The next morning, Walter woke earlier than usual. He had spent much of the night thinking about Leonardo's visit, still half convinced he had dreamed the entire encounter, but the business card on his nightstand with a private number scrawled on the back confirmed the reality of it. Walter went through his morning routine with unusual attention to detail. He brewed coffee with freshly ground beans he had been saving for a special occasion, pressed his best shirt, and even polished his shoes, preparations for his meeting with Brent Christensen that suddenly seemed more significant. The cafe where they were meeting was a quiet place in Los Feliz that had somehow survived the waves of gentrification that had transformed much of the neighborhood. Walter arrived early, securing a corner table with a view of the entrance. Brent arrived precisely at 10, looking every bit the successful industry professional he had become. Designer glasses, casual but expensive clothes, the confident posture of someone who knew their place in the world. "Walter," Brent said warmly, embracing his former teacher, "you look well." "And you look successful," Walter replied with a smile. "It suits you." They ordered coffee and fell into easy conversation. Brent had been one of Walter's most promising students 15 years earlier, not the most naturally talented, but certainly the most determined. Now he was a casting director for a major studio, with influence that far exceeded what his youthful ambitions had imagined. "So," Walter said after they had caught up on personal matters, "you mentioned something about a coaching opportunity." Brent nodded. "There's a director, Emily Hawkins, making her first feature after a series of acclaimed shorts. She's working with some inexperienced actors who have great natural presence but limited technical training. She asked if I knew anyone who could work with them before principal photography begins." "And you thought of me," Walter said, touched by the gesture. "I always think of you when someone needs real guidance, not just industry polish." Brent leaned forward. "It's a small project with a limited budget, but Emily is the real deal. Everyone's watching to see what she does next." Walter appreciated the opportunity, but after last night's unexpected visit, it felt strangely anticlimactic. "I'd be happy to meet with her." "Great, I'll send her your information." Brent hesitated, then added, "There's something else I wanted to discuss, something more personal." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "I'm developing a documentary series on influential acting teachers, the people who shape the performers we all know, but whose names never appear in the credits. I want you to be part of it." Walter felt a complex emotion rise in his chest, something between gratitude and discomfort. "I'm not sure I belong in that category anymore, Brent." "That's exactly why you do." Brent's expression was earnest. "Walter, do you have any idea how many successful actors still talk about you? How many directors ask whatever happened to Walter Lyons? You disappeared from the industry, but you never disappeared from the impact you had." Before Walter could respond, his phone buzzed. The screen showed the private number Leonardo had given him. "Excuse me," Walter said to Brent, answering the call. "Hello? Walter, it's Leonardo. Is now a good time to talk about scheduling our first session?" Walter glanced at Brent, who was watching him with curious eyes. "I'm actually in a meeting right now. Can I call you back in half an hour?" "Of course. Sorry to interrupt." Walter ended the call and returned his attention to Brent, who was now looking at him with increased interest. "Important client?" Brent asked. "Something like that," Walter replied, not yet ready to share the unexpected development in his professional life. They finished their coffee, with Brent providing more details about the documentary project. By the time they parted, Walter had agreed to at least consider participating, though he remained ambivalent about revisiting a career he had been forced to leave behind. Walking home, Walter found himself standing taller than he had in months, perhaps years. 2 opportunities in less than 24 hours, one from an unexpected A-list actor, another from a former student who had not forgotten him. It was as if the universe was suddenly correcting a long-standing imbalance. When Walter reached his apartment, he called Leonardo back and arranged for their first session to take place the following day. After hanging up, he walked slowly around his small living space, seeing it through new eyes. The faded photographs on the walls were no longer just mementos of a lost past, but evidence of a legacy that had continued without his awareness. Walter opened the window, letting in the sounds and sense of the city. For the first time in years, he felt a sensation he had almost forgotten: possibility. Walter spent the rest of the day preparing for his session with Leonardo. He pulled out notebooks from storage boxes that had remained untouched for years. Detailed, records of exercises, techniques, and observations from his most productive period as a coach. The pages were filled with his precise handwriting, documenting breakthroughs and setbacks, methods that worked and those that didn't. One notebook in particular caught his attention, a black leather journal from 15 years earlier when he had worked with Michelle Williams on a role that would eventually earn her first major award nomination. Inside were notes on the specific techniques he had developed to help her access emotional states that had previously eluded her. Walter ran his fingers over the pages, remembering the intensity of those sessions. The moment when Michelle had finally broken through her self-imposed limitations. That evening, Walter called Christopher Fletcher, his old colleague who had recommended him to Leonardo. "Walter Lyons," Christopher answered warmly. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "So you did send Leonardo DiCaprio to my door," Walter said, a note of accusation in his voice. Christopher chuckled. "I merely suggested he would benefit from your expertise. The dramatic entrance was his own creative choice." "Why me, Chris? There are dozens of coaches he could have approached." There was a pause on the line. "Because he needs what only you can provide. And perhaps because I thought you might need it too." Walter didn't respond immediately, recognizing the truth in Christopher's words. "Thank you," he finally said. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've spent 3 weeks with Leo, then you can decide if it was a favor or a punishment." After they hung up, Walter spent another hour reviewing his notes, then went to bed early, wanting to be fresh for the next day's session. Morning arrived with a clarity Walter hadn't experienced in years. He prepared his apartment, clearing space in the living room to create a makeshift studio. It wasn't ideal, but Walter had always maintained that true acting work could happen anywhere. A well-equipped studio was a luxury, not a necessity. Leonardo arrived precisely at 9, dressed casually and carrying a backpack that looked like it belonged to a college student rather than a Hollywood star. "Good morning," Walter greeted him, gesturing him inside. "I hope you found the place easily enough." "GPS makes everything findable," Leonardo replied with a smile. "Though your building doesn't exactly scream, 'legendary acting coach resides here.'" Walter raised an eyebrow. "If you're looking for glamour, you've definitely come to the wrong place." Leonardo's expression became serious. "I'm not looking for glamour. I'm looking for substance." Walter nodded, appreciating the response. "Then let's begin. Tell me about this character you're preparing to play." Leonardo set his backpack down and took a seat. "His name is James Forrester, former child prodigy in mathematics who published groundbreaking work in his 20s, then gradually faded from academic relevance. Now he's in his 50s, teaching at a community college, watching younger mathematicians build upon his early work without acknowledgement. "And what brings him to the center of this story?" Walter asked. "One of his former students makes a major mathematical breakthrough using an obscure theorem James published decades ago. Suddenly, James is pulled back into a world that had forgotten him, forced to confront his feelings about his lost potential, his resentment, his fear that he's truly become irrelevant." Walter paced slowly as he listened. What happens to him? Does he find redemption, revenge, reconciliation? "That's what makes the script so compelling," Leonardo said, leaning forward. "It's not about a dramatic comeback or a bitter downfall. It's about something more nuanced. James learning to redefine success on his own terms, to find meaning in the impact he's had, rather than the recognition he's received." Walter stopped pacing, struck by the parallel to his own situation. "I see why this role speaks to you," Leonardo nodded. "It's challenging because it requires subtlety. James isn't experiencing dramatic breakdowns or explosive moments of catharsis. His journey is internal, gradual, the kind of performance that can easily become too subtle to register or too heavy-handed to believe." "Have you brought the script?" Walter asked. Leonardo reached into his backpack and pulled out a well-worn screenplay. I've been living with it for weeks, but I still feel like I'm circling the character rather than inhabiting him. Walter took the script and flipped through it, scanning scenes and dialogue. Before we dive into specific scenes, I want to understand your current approach. If I asked you to perform a scene as James right now, what would be your entry point into his emotional state? Leonardo considered the question. I've been focusing on his physical presentation, the way disappointment and resignation might manifest. In his posture, his movements, I've been observing professors at UCLA, watching how differently the established scholars carry themselves compared to the adjuncts and lecturers. A solid observational foundation, Walter acknowledged, but external. Characteristics can only take you so far. What about James's internal landscape? What does he want? What does he fear? What does he believe about himself that isn't true? Leonardo hesitated. That's where I'm struggling. I understand his situation intellectually, but I'm having trouble connecting with the emotional reality of someone who peaked early and has spent decades watching his relevance diminish. Walter set the script down and faced Leonardo directly. That's where we'll start then. Not with the script, not with the character, but with the emotional truth that underpins his experience. And to do that, we need to find the analogous experiences in your own life. I'm not sure I have any, Leonardo admitted. My career hasn't exactly followed that trajectory. Perhaps not professionally, Walter agreed. But the core emotional experiences, disappointment, invisibility, the fear of irrelevance, those are universal. We just need to find where they live in you. For the next 2 hours, Walter led Leonardo through a series of exercises designed not to rehearse scenes, but to access emotional states. They explored memories of rejection, moments when Leonardo had felt overlooked or underestimated, experiences that had challenged his sense of identity. By midday, they were both exhausted, but Walter could see that something had shifted in Leonardo's understanding of the character. This approach is different from what I'm used to, Leonardo admitted as they took a break. Most coaches I've worked with start with the text, with the character's background, with scene analysis. Walter nodded. Those are all valuable tools, but they're scaffolding. What we're doing is laying the foundation. Without an authentic emotional connection to the character's core experience, all the technical work in the world won't create a performance that resonates. After their break, they began working with the script, selecting a scene where James confronts the former student whose success has thrust him back into the spotlight. As Leonardo performed the scene, Walter observed closely, noting the moments where the emotional preparation from their morning session influenced his delivery and the places where Leonardo was still relying on technique rather than authentic connection. Stop, Walter said after Leonardo had run through the scene twice. You're still protecting yourself. Leonardo looked confused. What do you mean? In this scene, James is exposed, raw, vulnerable, confronting his own perceived failure through the success of someone else. But you're still maintaining a layer of control of Leonardo DiCaprio playing a man in pain rather than simply being a man in pain. Leonardo nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in Walter's observation. How do I move past that? By being willing to fail spectacularly, Walter said simply. True breakthrough performances require actors to abandon the safety nets they've built over years of work. You've developed incredibly effective techniques throughout your career, but sometimes those same techniques can become barriers to the very authenticity you're trying to achieve. They spent the remainder of the afternoon working on that single scene, with Walter pushing Leonardo to strip away layers of practiced performance until something raw and unpolished emerged. By the end of the day, both men were emotionally drained, but satisfied with the progress they had made. As Leonardo prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Same time tomorrow? Walter nodded. Bring comfortable clothes. We'll be doing more physical work to access emotional states. After Leonardo left, Walter sat alone in his apartment, replaying the day's session in his mind. There had been moments when he had glimpsed the Leonardo DiCaprio that audiences rarely saw. Not the confident, charismatic star, but a vulnerable artist, still searching, still learning, still hungry to push beyond his already considerable achievements. More surprisingly, Walter had felt something reawaken in himself. The particular satisfaction that came from guiding a talented performer toward a deeper understanding of their craft. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, one that had once been the driving force of his life. The following day began with physical exercises designed to bypass Leonardo's intellectual approach to the character. Walter had him perform repetitive movements until exhaustion began to break down his habitual patterns, creating space for new discoveries. The body remembers what the mind tries to protect, Walter explained, as Leonardo moved through the exercises. Emotional armoring isn't just psychological, it's physical. By exhausting your familiar patterns, we create openings for authentic responses to emerge. As the session progressed, Walter observed Leonardo's growing frustration with the demanding physical work. Rather than easing up, Walter intensified his direction, pushing Leonardo toward the edge of his tolerance. "This isn't acting," Leonardo protested after a particularly grueling exercise. "No, it's preparation for acting," Walter countered. "Right now, your brilliant mind is your greatest obstacle. You're thinking your way into this character when you need to be feeling your way into him." Something in Walter's words struck a chord. Leonardo fell silent, then nodded and resumed the exercise with renewed commitment. By midday, the breakthrough Walter had been waiting for began to emerge. Moments of unguarded expression, flashes of emotional truth that transcended technique. After a brief lunch break, they returned to scene work, this time approaching a quieter, more introspective moment in the script. The physical preparation had altered Leonardo's access to the character's emotional landscape, and his performance took on a quality of lived experience rather than skillful interpretation. "There," Walter said quietly when Leonardo finished the scene. "That's James Forrester." Leonardo nodded, understanding what Walter meant. "I felt different that time, less like I was reaching for his emotions and more like they were simply present. That's the difference between crafting a performance and embodying a truth," Walter explained. "Both have their place, but the performances that resonate most deeply come from embodiment rather than construction." As their second day together concluded, Walter felt a growing sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The work with Leonardo was challenging him to articulate principles and approaches he had developed over decades, but had rarely been asked to explicitly define. That evening, Walter received a call from Emily Hawkins, the director Brent had mentioned. Their conversation was brief but promising. She was indeed interested in having Walter work with her cast, particularly two young actors with limited formal training. "Brent speaks very highly of you," Emily said. "He mentioned you have a unique ability to help actors find emotional authenticity in their performances." "That's certainly my aim," Walter replied. "When would you need me to start?" "We begin rehearsals in about a month. Would you be available for 3 weeks of preparatory work before we start shooting?" Walter realized that the timing would align perfectly with the conclusion of his work with Leonardo. "Yes, I believe I would be available then." After arranging to meet with Emily the following week to discuss details, Walter hung up and sat in thoughtful silence. Two professional opportunities had appeared almost simultaneously after years of near invisibility in the industry. It seemed too coincidental to be mere chance. Walter's suspicions were confirmed the next morning when Leonardo arrived for their third session. "I had an interesting call from Emily Hawkins yesterday," Walter said as they settled in to begin their work. She's directing an independent film and wants me to coach her actors. Leonardo's expression gave nothing away. Emily's talented. I saw her short film at Sundance last year. Walter hummed non-committally. And I suppose you had nothing to do with her suddenly reaching out to me? A slight smile crossed Leonardo's face. I might have mentioned your name when her project came up in conversation with Brent Christensen. I see, Walter said. And was this entire coaching arrangement with you some elaborate scheme to resurrect my career? Leonardo's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. No, I genuinely need your help with this role. The fact that others in the industry might benefit from your expertise again is a separate matter entirely. Walter studied Leonardo's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Very well, let's continue with our work then. The third day focused on scene analysis, with Walter guiding Leonardo through a detailed examination of the script's subtext. They dissected the characters' relationships, the power dynamics at play in each scene, and the unstated emotions driving James Forrester's interactions with others. What's interesting about James, Walter observed as they discussed a pivotal scene, is that his resentment isn't directed at his former student. It's directed at himself. Leonardo considered this. For not achieving more. For allowing external validation to define his sense of worth, Walter clarified. James doesn't resent his student's success. He resents that he needs that same recognition to feel valuable, and he hates himself for needing it. This insight shifted Leonardo's approach to the scene, lending his performance a layer of self-directed anger that transformed the interaction from accusatory to confessional. By the end of the day, they had mapped the character's emotional journey through the entire script, creating landmarks for Leonardo to navigate during filming. As days turned into weeks, their sessions developed a rhythm. Mornings were devoted to preparation, physical exercises, emotional recall, sensory work, while afternoons focused on applying those preparations to specific scenes. Walter introduced techniques he had developed throughout his career, many of which had been forgotten or overlooked by the current generation of acting coaches. Most contemporary approaches focus too heavily on psychological realism, Walter explained during their second week. They neglect the physical and vocal dimensions of performance, the ways in which emotion manifests in the body before the mind has even registered it. Leonardo absorbed Walter's teachings with the focus and dedication that had defined his career. He arrived each day prepared, having worked on the previous day's discoveries overnight, ready to push further into the character's reality. Walter found himself consistently impressed by Leonardo's work ethic and his willingness to abandon comfort in pursuit of artistic truth. Midway through their second week, Walter received another unexpected call, this time from Gregory Wiggins, a former student who was now a respected character actor with a long list of credits. Walter, it's Greg Wiggins. I heard through the grapevine that you're back in the coaching game. Walter smiled at the familiar voice. News travels fast in this industry. Only the good kind, Gregory replied. Listen, I'm preparing for a stage role, O'Neill's long day's journey into night, and I'm struggling with some aspects of the character. Any chance you'd be willing to work with me for a few sessions? By the end of their second week together, Walter had received 3 more inquiries from actors seeking his guidance. The industry's memory, it seemed, was longer than Walter had given it credit for. A whisper of Walter Lyon's return to coaching had been enough to rekindle interest in his approach. Leonardo noticed the change in Walter's demeanor as their third week began. You seem different today, he observed as they prepared for their session. Walter nodded. I've been receiving calls from actors interested in working with me. It's unexpected, but not unwelcome, Leonardo asked. No, Walter admitted. Not unwelcome at all. Their final week together, saw both men reaching new depths in their work. Leonardo had progressed from intellectual understanding of James Forrester to an embodied knowledge that informed every aspect of his performance. Walter had rediscovered the passion that had once defined his professional life, along with a newfound appreciation for the legacy he had created through his former students. On their final day together, they worked through the most challenging scene in the script, a moment when James confronts his own reflection, literally and metaphorically, and begins to see himself clearly for the first time in years. As Leonardo performed the scene, Walter watched in silence, witnessing the culmination of their 3 weeks of intensive work. The performance was revelatory, nuanced, authentic, and deeply moving. When Leonardo finished, the apartment remained quiet for several moments. "Well?" Leonardo finally asked. Walter cleared his throat, unexpectedly moved by what he had witnessed. "That," he said simply, "is why you have the career you have." Leonardo smiled, appreciating the understated compliment. "I couldn't have found this performance without your guidance, Walter. You've transformed my understanding of this character and of my own approach to acting." As they concluded their final session, Leonardo handed Walter an envelope. "A token of my appreciation." Walter took it hesitantly. "This isn't necessary. You've already paid my fee." "It's not money," Leonardo clarified. "Just something I thought you should have." After Leonardo left, Walter opened the envelope to find a key and an address written on a card. Curious, he took a taxi to the location, a building in a vibrant area of Los Angeles that housed several production companies and talent agencies. Using the key, Walter accessed a suite on the 4th floor to find a beautifully appointed studio space. Large windows allowed natural light to flood the room, which was furnished with simple, elegant furniture arranged to create distinct areas for different types of coaching work. A note on the desk read, "Walter, this space is leased for 1 year with an option to extend. Consider it both a thank you and an investment in the future of performance. The actors of this generation deserve to learn from someone who understands that great acting comes from truth, not technique alone." L. Walter stood in the center of the studio, overwhelmed by the gesture. The space represented not just a physical location for his work, but a second chance at the career he had thought was behind him. That evening, Walter returned to his small apartment with a new perspective. The faded photographs on his walls no longer seemed like relics of a lost past, but reminders of the impact he had already had and could have again. He packed a small bag with essentials, planning to return to the studio early the next morning to prepare for his meeting with Emily Hawkins and her cast. As Walter organized his teaching materials, his phone rang. The screen displayed Alyssa Henderson, MD, another name from his list of former students, now a successful actress known for her portrayal of a doctor in a long-running television series. "Walter," she said when he answered, her voice warm with affection, "I've been trying to reach you for ages. I'm directing my first feature film, and I need your eye during rehearsals. Please tell me you're available." Walter smiled, looking around. At his small apartment, a space that had felt like exile, but had ultimately become the site of his professional rebirth. "As it happens," he replied, "I am available, and I even have a studio where we can work." 2 months later, Walter stood in that same studio, now a bustling center of activity. The walls displayed production stills from Emily Hawkins' film, currently in post-production, alongside schedules for Walter's coaching sessions with various actors. The space had quickly become known as a place where performers could do the deep, transformative work that commercial studios rarely allowed time for. Walter was reviewing notes for an afternoon session when his phone buzzed with a text from Leonardo. "Have you seen the early reviews?" Walter hadn't. He quickly searched online and found the first critical responses to Leonardo's performance as James Forrester, which had screened at a private industry event the previous evening. The reviews were unanimous in their praise, with several critics calling it the most subtle and moving performance of Leonardo's career. One review in particular caught Walter's attention. DiCaprio has always been a technically brilliant actor, but his portrayal of James Forrester reveals a new dimension to his craft, a willingness to inhabit the quieter moments of human experience with as much commitment as the dramatic ones. There's a lived-in quality to this performance that suggests DiCaprio has found a new level of artistic maturity. Walter smiled as he read the words, recognizing the specific qualities they had worked to achieve during their 3 weeks together. He texted back a simple response: "Congratulations, you earned every word of praise." Leonardo's reply came quickly: "We earned it. Dinner next week to celebrate?" "I'll check my schedule," Walter responded, glancing at his calendar, which was now filled with appointments, sessions, and meetings stretching months into the future. As Walter prepared for his afternoon session with a young actress preparing for her first leading role, he reflected on the strange journey that had led him here. 3 months ago, he'd been a forgotten figure teaching community center classes, convinced that his most significant contributions were behind him. Now, he was once again at the center of meaningful creative work, helping actors access deeper levels of truth in their performances. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of his next student. Walter welcomed her into the studio, immediately noticing both her nervousness and her determination. She reminded him of so many young actors he had worked with over the decades, talented, uncertain, hungry to improve. "Before we begin," Walter said, gesturing for her to take a seat, "tell me about the character you're preparing to play. Not the biographical details or the plot points, but the truth at the core of her experience. What does she want? What does she fear? What does she believe about herself that isn't true?" As the young actress began to speak, Walter listened intently, already formulating the approach that would help her find her way into the character's reality. This was the work he had been born to do, not just teaching technique, but guiding performers toward authentic emotional truth. And now, thanks to an unexpected visit from Leonardo DiCaprio, he had been given the chance to do it again. The studio, with its perfect light and thoughtful design, represented more than just a physical space for Walter's work. It was tangible, evidence that even after years of invisibility, one's legacy could reassert itself in unexpected ways. Walter had never stopped being the teacher his former students remembered. He had only lost sight of his own value. As Walter began working with the young actress, he felt the familiar flow of creative energy that had always defined his best teaching. The hours passed quickly, and by the end of their session, both teacher and student had made discoveries that would inform their work in the days ahead. That evening, as Walter locked the studio and prepared to head home, he paused to look at a new addition to the wall, a framed note from Leonardo that read simply, "To Walter Lyons, who reminded me that the most important performances happen when no one is watching." Walter smiled, recognizing the truth in those words. His most significant work had always happened in private spaces, rehearsal rooms, studios, quiet conversations with actors seeking to deepen their craft. His impact had never been measured in public recognition, but in the performances he helped shape, the artists he helped develop. As Walter walked out into the Los Angeles evening, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had rediscovered his purpose. The city around him was still the same place that had once forgotten him, but Walter moved through it differently now, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as an artist whose most meaningful contributions might still lie ahead. The story of Walter, Lions and Leonardo DiCaprio spread through Hollywood with the particular velocity reserved for tales of redemption and second chances. What had begun as a private coaching arrangement had evolved into something far more significant, a respected acting studio led by a teacher whose methods had been nearly lost to the industry. 6 months after Leonardo's unexpected appearance, at Walter's door, the small apartment in the West Side building had become a footnote in Walter's story rather than its final chapter. Walter now divided his time between his new studio and various film sets, where directors had begun requesting his presence during production, not just to work with individual actors, but to help shape the emotional texture of ensemble scenes. Morning began, like many others in Walter's new life, with a call from Spencer Hicks, a producer on Leonardo's James Forrester film, which had recently entered the award season conversation following successful festival screenings. Walter? Good. Morning. Have you seen the trades today? Walter, who was preparing for a morning session at his studio, admitted he hadn't. Well, you might want to take a look. The Hollywood Reporter has a feature on Leo's performance, and he credits you extensively. Calls you, and I quote, the invisible architect behind what might be the most honest work of my career. Walter felt a complex emotion, pride mixed with a certain discomfort at being thrust into the spotlight. Throughout his career, he had always preferred to remain behind the scenes, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than public recognition. That's very generous of him, Walter said simply. Generous but deserved from what I hear, Spencer replied. Listen, the reason I'm calling, we're planning a special screening next month followed by a Q&A with Leo and the director. Leo specifically requested that you join them on stage for the discussion. He wants to talk about the process you two developed. Walter hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the thought of discussing his methods before an audience of industry professionals was intimidating. Yet he also recognized the opportunity to advocate for an approach to acting that had fallen out of favor in an era of quick results and commercial pressures. I'd be honored, Walter finally said. After ending the call, Walter opened his laptop to read the article. Leonardo's comments were indeed generous, describing in detail how Walter's guidance had transformed not just his approach to the specific role, but his understanding of performance itself. Walter Lyons sees acting not as a technical exercise, but as an act of emotional archaeology. Leonardo was quoted as saying, "He taught me to stop performing James Forrester and start discovering him, to find the character's truth through my own experiences rather than constructing him from external observations." The article went on to mention that Walter was now working with several prominent actors and had established a studio that was quickly becoming known as a place where performers could engage in the kind of deep exploratory work that production schedules rarely accommodated. As Walter finished reading, his doorbell rang. His first student of the day had arrived, Gregory Wiggins, who was deep in rehearsals for his O'Neill play and struggling with the emotional demands of the role. "Morning, Walter," Gregory said as he entered the studio, setting down his bag and script. "I had a breakthrough with that third-act monologue last night. That exercise you suggested, writing the character's unsent letters, it unlocked something I hadn't been able to access before." Walter nodded, pleased but not surprised. The words we never say often reveal more truth than those we do. Edmund has a lifetime of unspoken thoughts weighing on him. Accessing those gives you the emotional foundation for the spoken text. They spent the morning working through several of the play's most challenging scenes, with Walter guiding Gregory toward a deeper understanding of the character's psychology. By midday, both men were satisfied with the progress they had made. As Gregory prepared to leave, he paused. "I ran into Darren Smith yesterday. He mentioned he's in talks to direct a new HBO series and wants you involved from the beginning, working with the entire cast during pre-production." Walter hadn't heard from Darren, another former student who had become a successful television director, but the prospect was intriguing. Working with an ensemble from the early stages of a project would allow him to help shape the emotional landscape of the entire production, not just individual performances. "That's the first I've heard of it, but I'd certainly consider it," Walter replied. After Gregory left, Walter had a quick lunch before his afternoon appointments, a session with Emily Hawkins to review edited scenes from her film, followed by a workshop with 3 young actors preparing for a stage production of Angels in America. As Walter watched the rough cut of Emily's film, he was struck by the performances she had captured from her inexperienced cast. The young actors displayed a raw authenticity that more seasoned performers sometimes struggled to achieve, their lack of established techniques proving to be an advantage rather than a limitation. "This is remarkable work, Emily," Walter said as the screening concluded. "Especially from Alex and Megan. They found something genuine in these characters." Emily nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and gratitude. "That's largely thanks to your work with them. Alex told me that your approach completely changed his understanding of what acting could be." They spent the next hour discussing specific scenes where adjustments might enhance the emotional clarity of the performances, with Walter offering suggestions for the editing process that might highlight the most authentic moments the actors had delivered. As Emily was leaving, she handed Walter an envelope. "Before I forget, an invitation to the premiere next month. The cast specifically asked that you be there. They consider you as much a part of this film as anyone." Walter accepted the invitation with a quiet "thank you," still adjusting to this new phase of his career where his contributions were acknowledged publicly rather than remaining behind the scenes. The workshop with the Angels in America cast that followed was challenging in different ways. The play's complex themes and emotional demands required a delicate balance, helping the actors access the necessary emotional depths without becoming overwhelmed by the material. By the end of the day, Walter was exhausted but fulfilled. This new chapter of his life demanded more of him than the quiet, routine existence he had settled into during his years of professional exile. But it also provided rewards that he had nearly forgotten, the satisfaction of guiding artists toward their most truthful work, of being part of a creative process larger than himself. That evening, Walter received an unexpected visit from Leonardo, who was in town for meetings before beginning production on his next project. "I should have called first," Leonardo said as Walter welcomed him into the studio, "but I was nearby and wanted to see what you've created here." Walter gestured around the space, which had evolved significantly since Leonardo had first presented it to him. The walls now featured production stills from various projects Walter had been involved with, alongside quotes about performance and truth that served as reminders of the studio's philosophy. "It's become more than I ever expected," Walter admitted. "A real community of artists committed to a certain approach to the work." Leonardo moved through the space, examining the photographs and notes pinned to a large corkboard, evidence of the creative processes that unfolded there daily. "I've been thinking about our work together constantly during press for the film," Leonardo said. "Every interview, someone asks about James Forrester, about how I approached a character so different from my previous roles. And every time I find myself talking about you." Walter smiled. "You give me too much credit. The performance was yours." Leonardo shook his head. "The performance came from what we discovered together. And that's actually why I stopped by. I have a proposition for you." Walter raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I'm establishing a foundation to support arts education," Leonardo explained. "Part of the initiative includes master classes for actors who wouldn't otherwise have access to high-level training. I'd like you to design the curriculum and lead the teaching staff." The offer took Walter by surprise. "That's a significant undertaking." "It is," Leonardo agreed, but I can't think of anyone better qualified. Your approach should be preserved and passed on to the next generation of performers. This would be a way to ensure that happens, to create a lasting legacy. The word legacy resonated with Walter. At 68, he was acutely aware that his time as an active teacher and coach was limited. The opportunity to codify his methods, to train others who might carry the approach forward, was deeply appealing. I'd need to maintain my work with individual actors, Walter said, already considering the practical aspects of such an arrangement. Of course, Leonardo nodded. The foundation work would be structured around your existing commitments. We can discuss the details over dinner. I have a reservation at Bastide at 8 if you're free. As they left the studio together, Walter reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. 6 months earlier, he had been a forgotten figure living in a small apartment, teaching community center classes to retirees. Now, he was walking to dinner with Leonardo DiCaprio to discuss establishing an educational foundation that would carry his teaching methods into the future. The restaurant was discreet, the kind of place that catered to celebrities who preferred to avoid public attention. As they were shown to a private table in the back, Walter noticed several recognizable faces among the other diners, some of whom nodded in acknowledgement, not just to Leonardo, but to Walter as well. Over dinner, they discussed the foundation in detail, its structure, its goals, the types of students it would serve. Leonardo had clearly given the matter considerable thought, presenting Walter with a preliminary outline that addressed everything from funding to facilities. The first year would be a pilot program, Leonardo explained. 20 students selected through an application process, with full scholarships covering their training and living expenses during the program. And who would these students be? Walter asked. What would we be looking for in applicants? Talent, obviously, Leonardo replied. But more importantly, a quality that's harder to define, a willingness to be transformed by the work. Not everyone wants that. Many actors are content with learning techniques that allow them to deliver competent performances. We'd be looking for those rare individuals who want something deeper, who approach acting as a means of exploring human truth rather than simply as a profession. Walter nodded, recognizing in Leonardo's words an echo of his own philosophy. And where would this program be housed? I've been looking at properties in upstate New York, former retreat centers with residential facilities and enough space for studios, classrooms, performance areas. Somewhere away from the industry where students can focus entirely on the work without distraction. As their conversation continued, Walter found himself increasingly engaged with the vision Leonardo was presenting, a space dedicated to the kind of deep, transformative work that commercial entertainment rarely supported, but that occasionally produced the performances that defined generations. By the time they finished dinner, the broad outlines of the foundation had taken shape in Walter's mind. It would be a significant commitment, requiring him to formalize approaches that had always been intuitive, to articulate principles that had evolved organically throughout his career. Yet the challenge was invigorating rather than daunting. I'd want to document your methods thoroughly, Leonardo said as they were leaving the restaurant. Interviews, recorded masterclasses, written materials, creating a comprehensive record of your approach that could guide the foundation even beyond your direct involvement. The idea of his methods outliving him, continuing to influence performers he would never meet, was profoundly moving to Walter. He had always viewed his work as existing in the moment, in the private space between teacher and student. The possibility that it might have a more lasting impact was something he had never seriously considered. As they said goodbye outside the restaurant, Leonardo mentioned one last detail. There's going to be a feature in the New York Times next Sunday, a profile on acting coaches who've shaped contemporary performance. You're prominently featured. They interviewed several of your former students, including me. Walter looked surprised. No one contacted me about this. Leonardo smiled. They wanted perspectives on your influence rather than a direct interview. They're calling it the invisible hand, the acting teachers who shape what we see on screen. I think you'll find it interesting reading. After Leonardo departed, Walter walked slowly back to his car, processing everything they had discussed. The foundation, the New York Times article, the continuing expansion of his teaching practice. It was far more than he could have imagined when Leonardo first appeared at his door 6 months earlier. As Walter drove home, he passed the West Side, apartments where his small unit still sat largely empty. He had maintained the lease, unable to completely let go of the space that had been his home during those years of professional exile. In some ways, that tiny apartment represented a crucial chapter in his story. The place where he had learned that even when the external trappings of success fall away, the core of one's life work remains. Walter hadn't returned to the apartment in weeks, but tonight he felt drawn to visit it once more. He parked on the street and climbed the familiar stairs, noting the same flickering light in the hallway that had never been properly repaired. Using his key, Walter entered the quiet space. It was largely as he had left it, though notably emptier. Most of his books and teaching materials had migrated to the studio, leaving the shelves bare and the desk uncluttered. The photographs still hung on the walls, however, visual reminders of a career that had once seemed concluded, but had instead entered an unexpected new chapter. Walter stood in the center of the living room, remembering the evening Leonardo DiCaprio had appeared at his door. That moment, improbable, almost cinematic in its unexpectedness, had altered the trajectory of Walter's life in ways he was still discovering.